Hello everyone, AmyR here with Prairie Paper and Ink with a couple of cards using another of the Tonic Studios Adorables stamp set line. And for today's cards, I'm using the Scent Wiff Love. I get a kick out of these sets, and they're like little punny sentiments and titles and all that. So this one has all these adorable little skunks, and as usual, I couldn't, decide on just one, so I decided to stamp all of them onto some of the Craft Perfect Ultra Smooth white cardstock. So I had rubbed my fingers on these stamps because they are brand new, I haven't used them yet, and just rubbing them really well with my fingers kind of helps condition them a little bit before I actually stamp them. And then I'm going to stamp these a couple of times with the Nuvo Hybrid Black Shadow ink. I am finding that their brand cardstock, their brand ink works perfectly with their brand alcohol markers. Who'd have thunk? A lot of times, when they're created to go together, that you get the best results. So that's what I did. I really like this cardstock. It is really smooth. It, for stamping, like solid image stamping would work really well on this, and ink blending and all that. But I'd stamp the images with that hybrid ink, and then I am using the Creative Pens, aka the Nuvo alcohol markers, to color these in. And I am using the Stormy grays for like the bulk of, the bodies of the skunks here. And then I added a little bit of the one coral color for their noses and their little cheeks and their ears. And I'm doing my typical kind of go-to when it comes to coloring, going darkest to lightest. If you struggle more with coloring or you don't have enough experience, etc., its rule of thumb generally is to go lightest to darkest because you do have much more control that way. For me, I've been doing this now 15 years and I'm impatient and I have very little time. So I've kind of really become very comfortable over the last few years coloring darkest to lightest with alcohol-based markers, and it just works for me. But I know when I first started, there's no way I could have done this. Like, I would have struggled so much. So I only bring that up just because what works for one person doesn't always work for another. And you kind of got to experiment with different color mediums and, ways to do it and all that stuff until you get really comfortable with it and, figure out what works for you. So I did all these little images, same colors. So I didn't include the footage of every single one because it's the exact same thing. And then for the little bunny, I used the Pebble grays for this one. That's a very like brownish gray, or Pebble Beach. I need to learn all the little collections, names and whatnot, but I did remember to keep track of the color numbers, etc., and put them on the screen for you guys. So same thing, went darkest to lightest, just colored him in, and then added that little bit of that coral reef color for his little cheeks. And then for the stump, I actually used the Cookies and Cream collection for this. I wanted a little bit of a lighter browns than the other brown markers. So same thing, started with my darkest, added some of the medium, and then I'm going to go in with the lightest color. And then once I've got that, I'm going to pull out the Organic Greens collection, and I'm going to color that little bit of grass. And then off camera, I end up actually stamping that stump a second time and the bunny, just so I had enough to do 2 cards. Because I really like the stump. It just gave, a little extra something to the little scene I'm going to create. So colored everything. And then for my backgrounds, I'm using more of that Ultra Smooth cardstock, and then I am using this stencil. This is the Linking Rings stencil, and I'm just taping my cardstock into place so that it doesn't move, and I'm just going to kind of tape the stencil over it, same reason, so it doesn't move. And then I'm going to blend 2 different Nuvo hybrid inks over this, and I gotta say, I think it was again the combination of their cardstock with this hybrid ink. It just blended a lot smoother than I was expecting. I don't work with hybrid inks much, especially in the last few years. I find them more often than not that I would struggle with them, etc., and I wouldn't get the results I wanted. But these blended on like butter. I was really impressed. So I started with Mint Macaroon. This is from the little Dream in Color pack, and I just blended it on, letting some areas be darker. I didn't want like a perfect blend because I kind of wanted a little bit of difference in it. And then I'm going to go in with Laguna Bay, which is from the SIREN pack. And I will have links to everything, like the whole supply list links, as always, in the description box and on the blog. But added that one lower down because I kind of wanted it that kind of ombre effect, you know, so it went lighter to darker. And blended that on, and I was done. It was simple. Like, just created a quick and easy, fun pattern little background with that. So once I was done blending that all on, I'm going to trim off the border pieces basically. And this ends up trimming down to exactly, because the stencil itself, like the opening, is 4 1/4 by 5 1/2, so it's A2 sized. So once I trim this down, this is basically an A2 size, but since I decided I wanted to do 2 cards, I'm going to cut this in half. So I'm going to trim off all of the excess here, and then I'm just going to trim this in half by cutting it at basically 2 1/8. Yeah, 2 1/8. So I have 2 strips. I have, you know, all my little characters, and then I also have scraps of the Ultra Smooth cardstock, and this is where I rarely use the chisel end of any type of marker. It's just not something I reach for, but for something like this, it's perfect. I just quickly scribbled the darkest gray onto a scrap of that cardstock so I could tint it the color I wanted it. I have every cardstock color under the sun, basically, at this point now. But again, I've been doing this for 15 years. And something, though, that is really convenient, whether you just want to match exactly or you don't have a lot of colored cardstock, is to use a marker or an ink pad or whatever to tint it the color you need, and just use white cardstock. So that's what I did here. Tinted it to that nice dark gray to kind of go with the little skunks. And then I die cut it with the Essential Love wafer die. And then I die cut the outline that comes with it from the white cardstock and adhere both those together. And then once I've got those adhered, I also had scribbled the marker onto some more of the Ultra Smooth cardstock and then made sure it was dry. Because even though alcohol markers technically dry quickly, it's amazing sometimes how long they actually take to dry. And you always find that out when you go to heat emboss over them. So I had made sure this was dry. And then I'm just going to stamp one of the sentiments from the Scent with Love set. And the sentiment actually says Scent with Love, like SCENT, you know, smell. And I just trimmed off the love portion of the stamp. You could mask it off if you don't want to cut your stamps. I have no problem cutting them. So I just cut that off because it was easier. And then I stamped that onto that little part where I had colored it dark gray with the clear embossing ink. And then I'm using some white embossing powder over that. And I'm going to melt that with my heat tool. So then I've got my little sentiment strips that I can trim down with my paper trimmer. So I'm just going to use my paper trimmer and trim these down into narrow little strips. So it will still say Scent with Love, but I'm using the Love die cut instead of the stamp just to give it that little extra something. So I'm going to trim these down, and then I can get to assembling my actual cards now that I've got like all my elements colored, cut out, die cut, etc. So my card bases are A2 sized, so 4 1/4 by 5 1/2. Just want to reinforce the scored fold here. And then I'm going to stamp the insides with another sentiment from the Scent with Love stamp set. And this one says, I order you. I can't say these with a straight face. It just makes me giggle. So stamp those with the black hybrid ink. And then I'm going to adhere the strips of stencil paper. I'm going to pop these up with some foam dimensionals here just to give it that little extra bit of dimension. And then I'm just going to flip over the card because the strip is actually still a tiny bit longer than the card. So I just flip that over and trim off the excess with scissors. And then I can start adhering my little characters and sentiments and whatnot with some craft tacky glue. So for both cards, I just created a little scene with the stump and the skunk and the little bunny, and then added the sentiments to kind of tie it all together. And then once I've got them adhered to both of my card bases, I am going to adhere the last 2 skunks to the inside of each card. Just, again, to tie it all together and just give them that little extra something. So I'm going to adhere these guys to the inside with the craft tacky glue. And then once those are adhered, I'm just going to add some Nuvo crystal drops in colors that kind of match the little color combos I have going with the cards. So I pulled out some oyster gray Nuvo drops. And I'm going light-handed with these. I'm not adding a ton. I just wanted to add that little extra bit, you know, that little bit of embellishment. So I added Oyster Gray, and then I have Calming Aqua. And then finally, I'm going to add a little bit of Ebony Black. So I like to apply these with a light hand. And I always do kind of a swirl motion as I'm letting go of the bottle and lifting it away from the card. I release the pressure and swirl at the same time, and that kind of gives it more of a smooth finish. And then to really smooth them out, and plus to kind of flatten them a tiny little bit. After I've applied them, I'm going to tap them on my work surface, and that just kind of helps to smooth out the crystal drops as well as flatten them a bit more and make them look a little more like enamel dots. And then I can set these aside to dry, and these cards are done. So as always, there'll be links below the video to the blog post. There will be a supply list with links to everything. So you can check that out below if you are interested. Thank you all so much for watching, for subscribing, for thumbs upping, for commenting. I really appreciate it. And I will see you all very soon in the next video. Bye.